right. So we're now recording. Awesome. So welcome to our first kind of content-driven teams session. So let me go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint. Can you all see that okay? Looking good? All right. So let's go ahead and talk about how we analyze sources. First of all, I kind of want to do a check. Did anybody have, has everybody looked at this source, one of the sources in history assignments yet? Is there anybody who's not clicked over into those? Awesome. So in terms of how to analyze sources today, we're going to talk a little bit about different kinds of sources that historians look at, and then we're going to kind of work through how we analyze them, okay, as budding historians that you are. Right. Sorry, I'm trying to do a dual screen setup so I can still see the Teams window. All right, I'm gonna move this over here. All right, can you still see the PowerPoint okay? Go ahead and hit raise hands if you can. Beautiful. So you're not seeing both of my screens, you're just seeing the PowerPoint screen for right now. Okay, awesome. Okay, you can go ahead and lower hands. All right, so when we're talking about sources, one thing we kind of might want to talk about first is how we do, like what exactly is history and how we do it, so we can kind of understand some of the sources that we look at. So anybody want to raise their hand and take a stab at giving me a basic definition of what history is? Or we're all very shy today. All right, Lavender, go for it.
I think history is recounting and retelling things that have already happened, like all of the past, anything that's occurred in the past.
Okay, good job. Yeah, at its most basic, history is just retelling what's happened in the past, right? Trying to make sense of what's happened in the past. So history, and I think you did a good job at talking about recounting or retelling, because some people are like, well, history's everything that's happened in the past. It's like, well, but it's studying everything that's happened in the past, right? There has to be some kind of like academic component to it. So we're going to be talking today about what kinds of sources historians use to write history, because we don't just pull everything off of the top of our heads. Okay, we actually do look at particular pieces of information. Okay. So as a historian, there are 3 different categories of sources that we use to write history. One of them, and the kind of the bread and butter for us, is what we call primary sources. Okay. So primary sources, the big definer between them and the other kinds of sources is that we look at primary sources, consider primary sources those that are created during the time period we're studying. So for example, this week we're looking at when all of the different European empires arrive and start claiming pieces of the Americas. So a primary source for us for this week's content would be looking at stuff that comes from that time period. So for example, this week you guys for the sources in history are looking at the tobacco brides of Jamestown, right? That source, if any of y'all have already looked at that. So that's considered a primary source because it's coming from this time period we're looking at. Makes sense so far? Good. All right, because it's from the time period we're looking at, anything, so long as it's created during the historical time period we're looking at, counts as a primary source. So a wide variety of different options that we could have. Any questions on that so far? Are we doing okay? All right, looks like we're doing good. So then we move into secondary sources. So secondary sources are created after the time period we're studying, but it's about that time period. So that means secondary sources are based on study of primary sources. So for example, your textbook, right? Author Eric Foner of your textbook looked at primary sources, right? And then he created this narrative about the past that you're reading about for class, right? So because of that, books, articles, documentaries, right? These are studies people have made of the past and narratives that they create. So one example of a secondary source that you've already seen is those of you who've done the earthquakes and tsunamis sources in history already. If you've looked at that, that's an article, right, based on the past. So that would be an example of a secondary source. Any questions on those? No? Awesome. And then the last one is what we call tertiary sources. Tertiary means 3. Tertiary sources are created after the time period we're studying, like secondary sources. But the difference between them is while secondary sources are based on primary sources, tertiary sources are based on secondary sources. So this means they're pulling information just from secondary sources, not necessarily from primary. So think of it kind of like a game of telephone, right? You're not getting like the clearest message because it's sort of being passed on and filtered a couple times before it gets there. So tertiary sources provide very basic information about a source, but they're not going to give you a whole lot of detail. Okay, so encyclopedias are a good example of a tertiary source. So the big difference between primary versus these other two is when it's created, right? Primary is created during, and then secondary and tertiary is after. So any questions on that so far? Good. All right, now let's talk a little bit about how you might see these in your daily life, because yes, historians use these to write history, but even you as, a layperson, right, not a professional historian, probably encounters each of these when you go about your daily business. So let's do an example. Raise your hand if you have seen Hamilton, the musical. All right, Mary has. Awesome. Surprised not more of you. If you've not seen it yet, if you have a Disney Plus subscription, watch it. If you haven't, see if you can borrow somebody's Disney Plus login. So Hamilton as a musical first came out on Broadway a couple of years ago. And before that point, if you asked people about Alexander Hamilton, maybe the only thing they'd be able to tell you is, oh yeah, that white dude on the $10 bill, right? I mean, how many of you guys know anything about, raise your hand if you know something more about Alexander Hamilton than that. Does anybody? No. Right? Now, that's completely understandable, right? So if people watching the musical Hamilton, whether it was they got lucky enough to get tickets for it on Broadway or they saw it when it dropped on Disney Plus, a lot of them had never heard of Alexander Hamilton before. And so this prompted a lot of Googling. Okay. So if you pull up Alexander Hamilton, right? Because this is basically what we do as humans, right? We don't know something, we want to look something up, we turn to Google. So if you pull up Google for Alexander Hamilton, this is what you get. Notice that we've got 253 million results. Ain't nobody got time to read through all of that. Now, you'll see the top result is Wikipedia. Okay. Who can tell me what kind of a source of the 3 categories we looked at Wikipedia is? If anyone volunteer. Gabriel.
Is it a tertiary?
Right, it's a tertiary source, right? Like it's the third source. It only contains very basic information, right? Mostly taken from secondary sources. Good job, Gabriel. So most people, if they're looking at Alexander Hamilton, they're just going to read his Wikipedia page, right? Or maybe like the little Google stub that's over here on the right. So for most people, just kind of trying to find general information, probably not going to go beyond the tertiary source. Okay. Now, if you were writing a paper on Alexander Hamilton, would just looking at Wikipedia be good enough? No, right? Because it doesn't have any sort of level of detail that you would need for a paper. Did you know that you can find more level of detail on a Google search? So for example, if you scroll down, I had to take a different screenshot because I couldn't fit in. If you scroll down on Alexander Hamilton's search list, so I just kind of scrolled down before I took the screenshot, you can see that there are actually some suggestions on the right-hand side. So this one up here is books. So this one actually is books written by Alexander Hamilton. So who can tell me what kind of source that would be? Who wants to volunteer?
Primary?
Primary, good job, Gabriel. It's a primary source, right? It's written by him. Okay. And then down here, and by the way, that's his main claim to fame, if you do look at a little bit more history, is being the primary author of the Federalist Papers. If you've never heard of those, we're going to cover those this semester when we get to the Constitution in History 1301. Okay. And then if you look down here at the second arrow, it says see results about, and there is this book titled Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow. So this would be what kind of source? It's a book about Hamilton, but not written by him.
Secondary?
Secondary, good job. Okay, so you can actually find primary and secondary sources in a Google search. You just need to know where to look for them. So everybody doing okay so far? Give me a hands up if you're doing all right. Awesome. Okay, so when you look at sources, whether you're looking at Wikipedia or a book or a primary source, there are certain questions that you should ask to get information from these sources. Okay. So things to look out for when looking at sources. One big one is what isn't here, right? Maybe something doesn't survive or something is missing. For example, if we wanted to know what daily life was like for let's say a woman living in Jamestown, why might that be difficult for us to find a lot of information on? Anybody have any ideas? You may have noticed that a lot of your history book focuses on dudes, right? Partly because most of the societies we're looking at are patriarchal, or they're male sort of dominated and controlled societies. So the average doings of a woman probably would not have been considered important enough to record. Maybe we're lucky enough that we get like a diary from a woman, but for the most part, that kind of stuff doesn't really survive. Okay. It's usually only sort of, especially if we go far back in the past, like official records, right? It's a little bit difficult to get at the sort of day-to-day life. Sometimes stuff just physically does not survive. Like for example, fabric, right? Fabric decays really easily, and so it's very difficult for us to study like the clothes that people wore in the past because they don't tend to survive very long. Sometimes people destroy evidence on purpose. Why might somebody destroy evidence on purpose? Any ideas? Why would someone destroy evidence? A lot of times people destroy evidence if they feel it makes them look bad or it incriminates them. One example is we know a lot about the Holocaust during World War II, right? The genocide of European Jews, because the Nazis kept meticulous records and didn't have time to destroy them before they were defeated. So sometimes when you look at a source, it's kind of obvious something isn't there. Other times it's a little bit more difficult. So that's just something to keep in mind. That's not necessarily something you might see in every source. What exists but I can't access or understand. So for example, source or that information is there, but you can't get to it or you can't make heads or tails of it. For example, sources located in war zones. It is a terrible time to be a historian or archaeologist who specializes in Syria, right? Because of the war in Syria there in 2020. Other times sources are there but classified. So like people have all these theories about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, for example. A lot of that stuff is still classified. And if you go to the National Archives, they are very serious on classification. Every time I go there, because I study World War II, a lot of stuff was formerly classified, is now declassified. Even though it's declassified, I still have to get permission, and I have to put this little declassified sticker on every photo I take of something. And they actually come around to police you too if you're not displaying your little badge that says you got permission. Sometimes sources are in languages that we can't read. Like, for example, I have an average reading comprehension of Spanish, but I'm not fluent. So if I'm reading a source in Spanish, especially if it's like older style Spanish, I may have difficulty understanding it. And there are some languages that we still haven't figured out as historians that we can't read. We know they're a language. We just can't, we don't know what they say because nobody exists anymore who speaks the language. The last kind of two I want to talk about, we'll go into more detail in a second on both of these. When we look at a source, you should always ask what is true and what is false. Figuring out kind of what is sort of factual is something that is really important, especially not just in our course, right, but in daily life when you read the news, for example. And also for the same reasons, bias is important too. We're going to talk in more detail about bias in a second, but bias is simply like a perspective or an opinion that somebody has that affects how they both kind of consume information and how they, portray something. So any questions before we move on to talk about how to determine what's true or false in a source? No? Awesome. All right, so checking source credibility. This is where we figure out how reliable is a source, right? How credible is a source? How believable is it? And these are some questions that I encourage you when you're looking at historical courses to read. There's also, although it's a little bit more geared towards new information, you can Google this. It's called the CRAP test with 2 A's. Each of those letters stands for a question to ask about source credibility. That's more for current news. Yes, Gabriel, you had a question.
I accidentally clicked it. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's fine. We're all learning teams together. Okay, so if you wanted to look at kind of more sort of the current sources or news articles, the CRAP test, and you can Google it and find it. I know our librarians use it a lot, especially for English classes. That's a kind of good checklist for like more current sources. For us as historians, the main questions we want to ask is where does this source come from? And who's creating it and why? You're going to notice that there's a lot different framing depending upon the purpose of a source. So for example, the document you're looking at for this week is the one on the bride's going to Jamestown. That document you're reading is a letter written by the company saying, here's how you're supposed to take care of these ladies, here's the terms that they're supposed to get married under. That's going to be a lot different than if you were reading, say, a promotional flyer trying to get women to sign up, right, to do this. I mean, imagine that. How do you sell, go ahead and we're going to put you on a ship. You're going to sail across this ocean for a couple months. You're going to get to this brand new colony, which is struggling to survive and has, in fact, resorted to cannibalism at one point. And you're going to marry a strange man you've never met. Right? So, I mean, you're going to see a lot different presentation, a lot different motive, right, in those different sources. Then you also want to see if you can verify the same facts in other sources, what we call kind of cross-checking. Do other sources confirm or contradict what's going on in this source? For example, as a historian, I specialize in riots. And for me, riots, I'll get to your question in a second, Itzel, I just saw it. For me, riots are difficult to study, right? They're very sort of spontaneous, they're violent, right? People are not really willing to talk about their involvement in riots. And so as historians, sometimes when we have a lot of riots happen at the same time, it's hard to figure out how many. For example, after World War I, there was a wave of riots across the United States in all these different places. And when we're trying to figure out how many riots happened in 1919, generally our rule of thumb is if we see evidence or an account of it in 2 different sources, then we can say with confidence there was a riot there. It's not that there wasn't a riot in a place where we only have 1 account or source. It's just we can't confirm it, right? All right, Isel asked, should we add those questions to our source for earthquakes and tsunamis? That's a good question. So earthquakes and tsunamis, right, is a secondary source. It's talking about, using combining scientific knowledge with anthropological knowledge, right? Asking the indigenous peoples who live there about their past experiences. You could definitely use this to kind of question the motivation, right, for these different scholars. So if you find that helpful, by all means, go ahead and use that for that source. That's a good question itself. Thank you. So in particular, what we see a lot of times is historically, a lot of historians tended to dismiss or discount indigenous stories of the past, whether they were talking about, earthquakes or tsunamis, or in another case involving North America. Oh, I'm blanking on the name of it. There was a European expedition searching for a Northwest Passage, and I'm trying to remember the name of the explorer, and I can't. And like the expedition failed, his ship was lost, they couldn't find it, and Native peoples kept having an account of encountering these people, and they're like, oh, well, no, they must be misremembering, blah, 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 blah. Guess what? That ship was found where the Native people said it was going to be. So there's actually a very long history of kind of dismissing or distrusting indigenous stories. So that's kind of interesting. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to share the article with you, because it seems like that trend is changing, that we're working together rather than against indigenous peoples. And I think that's the right direction to go. Other questions, comments, concerns so far? Are we doing okay? All right, moving on. Let's talk about bias. Now, you've probably heard of bias kind of portrayed as this horrible, horrible thing, right? If somebody says you're biased, that's not a good thing, is it? Bias, I think, gets a bad reputation because the truth of it is it's impossible to not have bias. Right? Yes, thank you, Thomas. Sir John Franklin and the HMS Terror. Thank you. I could not Google and do this at the same time. Thank you for looking that up. Yes. I don't know why I couldn't remember. I was like, Fear? No, the ship's name is not Fear. Thank you. HMS Terror. And Sir John Franklin was the explorer I was talking about in Canada. Awesome. Thank you, Thomas. Thomas for the win. All right. So bias. So like, for example, we just talked about how like historians were dismissing Native American stories about Franklin and the HMS Terror because they felt that Native Americans, because they didn't have a writing system for a long time, were less reliable narrators, right? So that was a bias that they had. And with biases, it's impossible to get rid of them, but the important thing is knowing what your bias is, right? Why do you have a bias? What is your bias? So that way you can account for it or you can compensate for it. So knowing your bias is what we kind of want to do. And when we're looking at a source, we want to be able to know what the source's bias is, right? But we also want to know what our biases are in looking at the sources. So when we look at a source, the way we can kind of try to figure out bias is, why does the creator approach the topic this way? Okay, why are they writing? So for example, why did these historians in the past just assume Native American stories couldn't be corroborated, right? What was the point of that? And sometimes bias is easier to spot. If you're reading somebody's diary or journal, then probably you're going to have a lot easier time finding bias than if you're reading like a Supreme Court ruling. Okay, but bias is there. It's just a little bit easier to see in some places than others. Your bias is important, right? Because every time you look at something, you have your own identity, opinion, past experiences that shape how you read something. So for example, looking at the Tobacco Brides of Jamestown document, you ladies in the class might have a different perspective than the dudes reading it because you are women and it's a document about women. That's not to say that the guys are disadvantaged. It's just that we might have a slightly different take or spin on it. When we talk about, aspects of my identity, gender is one of them. Religion, ethnicity, where you're raised, right? So when we talk about identity, these are things about you that are fairly sort of permanent and sort of integral to who you are. When we talk about past experiences, this could include like jobs or education or trauma, other things that you've lived through that have happened to you to shape your experience. For example, when we start talking about the Industrial Revolution later this semester in History 1301, you're going to notice probably that I am very sympathetic to workers and to labor unions. Part of the reason for that bias is I have training as a historian who studies labor. I have many family members who are members of labor unions. And so like I have both personal experience, right? Part of my identity, like my parents both were from working class families in Detroit who worked in auto factories, but I also have like education in it, right? So I know that. And when we get to people like, in History 1302, Andrew Carnegie or John D. Rockefeller, I'm not just going to say, like, they're evil, evil men because they screwed over workers. I'm still going to emphasize, they did nice things. They were philanthropists. But you might notice I'm a little bit more sympathetic towards workers. That would be an example of bias, right? I try to compensate for it, but my bias still exists. Any questions about bias? We hanging in there? All right, let's get to the meat and potatoes of analyzing a source. Whenever you look at a source, you're going to ask the W questions. Who created this source? What is going on in the source? Think of this one like if you had to summarize what was happening in the source, could you? Right? This is your reading comprehension question. So for example, if I give you a source on the Constitution, I want to know that you understand that this is a source on the Constitution. If you're telling me this source was about how aliens abducted cows, you kind of misunderstood what was going on, right? And the rest of your analysis might be a little difficult. When was this source created, right? Why is that an important one? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Why is when one of the most important questions? Lavender.
That way you can consider whether it's a primary or secondary source, so you know how much of it is completely, just how credible the source is for that.
Right, exactly. So that way you can determine, is this a primary source? Is it a secondary source, right? So that's why asking both when was this created and when is it describing, right? Those will be questions that help you determine, is this a primary source? Is this a secondary source? Good job. Where does this source take place? That one's an important one. And then the big money question is why? Okay. You can also put kind of how with this too. Why and how are intertwined together. So why is this important? How does it connect to what we've been reading in the textbook? Or how does this, how am I connecting this source of information I already know? Like, oh, this reminds me of this, right? This documentary that I saw at one time, or what I read in the textbook, or what I watched in a web lecture. What can this tell us about the past? So this is the hardest one. This is the one that requires a lot of practice, because most people have a pretty easy time with who, what, when, where. It's the why. So don't be discouraged if you're having a difficult time with why. I tell people practice the why question by picking out anything when you look at a source that you don't understand or that you think is funny or strange, or you're like, aha, like this ties into what we talked about last week in class. So in other words, if you're making observations about a source, you're going to get a lot more practice in understanding the why. Any questions about that? Do you guys want to practice? Let's work together and look at a source. All right, here we go. I'm going to put a picture up on the screen because I find that pictures are kind of the easy softball to look at first. All right, so let's look at a picture together. I'm going to put it up on the screen. All right, so I want you to look at this for a minute. Kind of get your initial impressions, things that jump out at you. And then we'll start going through the W questions together. All right, who wants to take a stab at who created this? Anybody have any guesses? Remember, this is practice, so nobody wants to be brave enough to attempt this. What's the difficulty in knowing who took a photograph?
We don't know the photographer.
Right, we don't know the photographer. They're not obviously there, right? I mean, we don't have like a stamp or anything on here, like sometimes you see with photo studios, right? So sometimes we just don't know who created a source, right? And in this case, you'd be like unknown, right? You might have to do more research and you could find the photographer, but just looking at it initially, you don't know, right? Sometimes I don't know is a perfectly acceptable answer. All right, let's skip over what for a minute. When? Any ideas when this ended? Anybody want to guess?
Was it around when like the meatpacking industry was having a lot of health?
Okay, yeah. Okay, that's a good guess. So why did you guess around the time the meatpacking industry is having some issues? What about the photo made you jump to that?
Just like with the background and all that. See the meats and the eggs and all that good stuff.
Yeah, we've got a lot of meats hanging up, right? And I mean, clearly, like they've already sort of been, somewhat butchered and processed, right? Okay, that's a good guess. Anybody else have alternate theories based on the picture? Lavender.
I was just thinking more like in between like World War I through World War II, just based off their dress. It looks more like that time period.
Right, so we can also look at their clothes, right? So Lavender's guessing a little bit later, right? So Gabriel was guessing around the time meatpacking was having issues, so that would be early 1900s, right? I think you were thinking of like The Jungle by Upton Sinclair.
Yes.
Yeah. So Lavender's guessing a little bit later. Okay. All right, so we have some good guesses, right? We're at least guessing 1900s, right? Because it's a photograph. It can't be older than the invention of photography. And it's black and white. So this is before color photography became popular, right? So we can kind of have a loose guess. All right, any ideas where this is? Anybody want to volunteer? Where is this? What are some clues that might help us out on this? Yes, Mary.
Well, I'm assuming it's in an English-speaking country since it says eggs, not like something else. So maybe America or England.
Okay, good job. So language, right? We have eggs right here. America or England would be a good guess, right? We also have, I don't know if anybody spotted this brand name, Crisco, right? Which is an American brand. Okay, so good guess. We can kind of use the clues again in the image to tell us where. So we've done who, when, and where. We haven't done the what yet. What is going on in this picture? Anybody want to take a guess? Because it's a weird picture, right? Thomas.
It almost looks like a family business.
It does kind of look like a family business. What makes you suggest kind of that it's particularly a family business?
the fact that they have a man on the right who I assume is a father, the one on the left who I assume is a mother, and then the two kids, the one on the left looks like a teenager, and the one on the far right being 5 or 6, kind of.
Yeah, kind of looks like Leave It to Beaver, right? So yeah, family business, right? We're clearly in some kind of business. Nobody's house looks like this, right? And the family's clearly posing. Okay, all right. To talk about the why, let's talk about like what jumps out at you as interesting when you saw this picture. What was the first thing you noticed? Anybody want to volunteer? Or were you just like, oh my gosh, that's really weird? I know Gabriel noticed the meat, right? Mary was talking about how the signs were in English, right? All these eggs. Thomas.
What is this stuff on the bottom of the photo?
That is glasses of, or bottles of milk. I'm glad you asked that. All this stuff down here, bottles of milk. Mm-hmm. So this is how we know it's not like an average day at the store, right? Nobody stores glass bottles of milk lined up on the floor like that. That's just asking for destruction. So we've got a whole bunch of bottles of milk down here. We've got the meat hanging up here that Gabriel already pointed out. We've got, you know, like huge cartons of eggs that Mary noticed, right? I pointed out the Crisco. Everybody know what Crisco is? It's vegetable shortening. That's an awful lot of Crisco they're buying. Like, I only usually use Crisco if I'm making like oatmeal cookies or like pie crust. Like, I don't use it that often. Does this photo seem weird to any of you?
It kind of does to me. I feel like the display is really weird, that everything is like in a line. Like visually, it looks weird to me. It almost looks like it could be like an advertisement or something like that type.
You are exactly right, Lavender. You've guessed right. This is an ad. Does that help our understanding to know that this is staged and this is an advertisement? Let me blow your minds even further. This is an ad for a grocery store. Okay, like Thomas guessed and Lavender guessed, an ad for a grocery store. And this ad was meant to show how much food an American family, an average American family, bought in a year in the 1950s. Okay, so the time period guessed, like Gabriel and Lavender were guessing the right century, right? How much food an average American family ate in a year. Now that you know that piece of information, like how could we analyze this? Think about a comparison. If we recreated this photo this year with the amount of food an average American family of 4 ate in a year in 2020, would it look different? What do you think would be the most different? Thomas, go ahead.
You definitely wouldn't have packaged meat the way they do here. Also, the bottles of milk and the egg boxes, you don't see that all that often anymore.
Right, especially because there's a lot of people who are lactose intolerant. All right, I saw Mary's hand up.
I think the type of food would change. Like, it's not all pigs hanging up. Like, some of it's packaged food, some of it's processed stuff. It's just a lot different what we eat now.
Yeah, there'd probably be a lot more kind of like frozen meals, right? So like you said, processed and prepackaged stuff. Lavender, did I see your hand up?
I was actually just gonna say what Mary was saying. Just how different packaged food is now, and how like a lot of what they have is like the raw ingredients, and now it's mostly like already assembled meals.
Right, right. So we could maybe make generalizations about, we could look at this picture and say this shows us how different people ate in the 1950s, right? And I know Lavender had guessed in between World War I and World War II, right? And the 20s would be a good decade to guess this. Why not the 1930s? Anybody think what was happening? Anybody know what was happening then? Lavender.
The Great Depression?
Right, the Great Depression. Do you think the average American was eating this well during the Great Depression?
No.
No. Right. Okay. So this is an example of how we can analyze a source, right? I mean, there's lots of interesting things we can pick out here. For example, we've got cornflakes up here in the left-hand corner, got coffee, right? So there's lots of different things we can look at. We can talk about, diet. We can talk about prosperity, right? We can talk about different ways that people are cooking. Definitely, if you read a cookbook from the 1950s, very different from today, right? So there's lots of stuff that we could pull out from this photograph. So that's an example of how to analyze a source. Any questions? Do you want to look at the source you guys have for this week, the tobacco brides? Look at a piece from that? In other words, would you like me to help you with that assignment?
Yes.
Gabriel's like, yes, let's not play around. Let's look at that. All right, so this is just a small piece of that tobacco bride's letter, right? All right, let's see if we can figure out what's going on here. There are nearly 50 more women, which are shortly to come, sent by our most honorable Lord and Treasurer, the Earl of Southampton, and certain worthy gentlemen, who, taking into their consideration that the plantation can never flourish till families be planted, and the respective wives and children fix the people to the soil. My God, this is all one sentence. This is very old school English. Therefore have given this fair beginning, so many clauses, for the reimbursing of whose charges it is ordered, that every man that marries them give 120 pounds weight of the best leaf tobacco for each of them. And in case any of them die, that proportion must be advanced to make it up upon those that survive. All right, this is old school English. This is a huge run-on sentence with lots of clauses. Let's try to kind of pick out some pieces. Do we know who wrote this? Any indicators here, or should we say unknown? I mean, we know somebody who's involved, right? Who's the person whose name dropped?
The Earl of Southampton?
Yes, Lord and Treasurer, the Earl of Southampton, right? So he's name dropped, but he's obviously not the person who's writing it. Okay. So we at this point would be author unknown. Let's see. Could we tell when this is just from this snippet? It'd be difficult to guess, right? I mean, obviously the language might tip us off to a general time period. But notice here they're saying the plantation can never flourish till families be planted. Do you know the usage of plantation here? It's an older style usage. What do we define a plantation as today? What is a plantation? Anybody want to volunteer? I say plantation, you think what?
A very large farm kind of deal.
Right, like a very large commercial scale farm. Usually with pre-Civil War, the use of slave labor, because it's so large. In this case, they're using plantation in the Old English way, in which they mean colony. So for them, plantation means colony. So they're saying the colony can never flourish till families be planted. So that kind of gives us an indication that this is during a time period when, and then we know they're going to Jamestown, right? When the Jamestown colony is not fully established. So we can say, okay, early. Okay. They're saying that the colony can't succeed until we have families. Okay, so what's going on here? Anybody want to take a stab at what is happening?
The way it's written is kind of more of like a, I don't know how exactly you'd say it, but like a letter or almost even like a order or proclamation. I don't know. It's some like big announcement. Definitely is an interesting indicator.
Yep, it's a letter, right? And you're right. It's kind of making an announcement. They're shipping women. Okay, in this case, they're saying, we're shipping women. We're going to ship more women to you in the future is what they're saying. To Jamestown. And they're shipping them to get married, right? And they're saying for every man that marries one of these women shipped over, what do they have to give up? I highlighted it. If you're a dude who wants to marry one of these women shipped over, go ahead, Lavender.
Tobacco, 120 pounds of tobacco.
Yeah. Now, notice when you look at the rest of the letter, you're going to see the full context here. Like, it sounds like they're buying them just in this paragraph, right? Like, if you would like to buy a wife, you just got to fork over 120 pounds of tobacco. Okay. It's a little bit more complicated in that document. This is why sometimes I have students who read this and go, they're purchasing slaves. No, these women aren't slaves. You're going to see why in the rest of the letter that you're going to read for the sources and history assignment. But certainly, like, the men have to give up something for the privilege of getting a wife, right? And if they're paying in tobacco, what does that maybe tell us about Jamestown?
That they have a lot of tobacco?
Right. So they have a lot of tobacco. I haven't had enough coffee this morning. They've had a lot of tobacco, right? Good job, Mary. So they're using tobacco as currency. So tobacco, they have a lot of it. It's valuable, right? Okay. So this is just kind of a heads up sneak peek, right, on the sources of history. Like I said, this is one part of the letter. You have the whole letter for your sources of history assignment. But now you at least know the basics of what's going on. You have women being sent over specifically to marry these guys they've never met. And the men have to pay the company, who's the Jamestown company is the one shipping them over, for the privilege of getting a wife. Right. If you are interested, there's actually a book. Do I have it handy? No, I do not. There's a book about the Jamestown brides that just came out earlier this year. It is on my to-read stack, which is quite large. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen sharing. Any questions as we wrap up? Everybody feel a little bit more confident in being able to analyze a source?
Yes, ma'am.
Awesome. So I'm going to be posting a copy of this recording and also a copy of the PowerPoint if you just want to use it to kind of take notes or to consult, you know, the W questions if you're looking at other sources. I would strongly recommend that you guys use this resource because you have your first writing assignment for the 16-week History 1301 class. Y'all have your first writing assignment, the short essay, next week. And so I'm going to give you a primary source, and you can already view it if you click into the week 3 folder. I'm going to give you a primary source to analyze. And so you might want to start looking at that, especially because I'm trying to give you something a topic we've already covered. So the language is going to be old school, like you just saw in the Jamestown letter. So it might take you a little while to read. All right, if we have no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording right now. And if you do come up with questions later,